this is going to be a much longer. This is probably going to be more closer to about 3 hours or so, just to give you a heads up. But like I said, yeah, if you want, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, and then whoever's with me is great. But I won't judge you if you gotta you gotta bail. So white fragility. So we're gonna watch a quick video on white fragility.
How do you feel when you see a headline like this? Or this? If you're white, you might feel uncomfortable, guilty, or even angry. In this video, we're going to talk about why that happens and how to overcome it. Most white Americans don't realize our culture protects us from having to truly confront racial inequality, which gives us a major blind spot when it comes to understanding what the reality of systemic racism is for people of color, or how complicit we may be in their oppression. We think of racism as something bad people engage in, instead of something we're conditioned into from childhood. As a result, when indirect, unconscious, or less obvious forms of racism and discrimination are exposed for what they are, it challenges our beliefs about ourselves and our world, provoking our own blind spots when it comes to race. And more often than not, well, let's just say we don't handle it well. The phrase was invented by Robin DiAngelo, a multicultural education expert, to talk about what happens consciously and unconsciously when white Americans are confronted with challenges to white dominance. According to DiAngelo, even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, including the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors wind up preserving the status quo, protecting white comfort, and therefore reinstating white dominance. White fragility is triggered by interruptions, in which white codes of discourse are broken to force a white person to confront racism, and they show up in a number of different ways. Like when anyone, white or otherwise, suggests that a white person's viewpoint is racist. When people of color talk candidly about their experiences of racism. When people of color choose not to share stories or answer questions about their racial experience. And especially whenever people of color choose not to protect the racial feelings of white people. Some other instances of racial stress include when white people are denied access to Black safe spaces or Black bodies. When white people are told their actions have racist impacts. When racial inclusivity gets prioritized over group membership. When double standards are exposed. When white meritocracy is challenged by exposing white privilege. Whenever white centrality is challenged by narratives in which people of color are front and center without being presented stereotypically. And finally, when a person of color holds a position of leadership. Whatever the cause, knee-jerk overreactions protect white dominance by silencing non-white voices and segregating whites from people of color. By distancing ourselves from racially stressful situations and refusing to consider other perspectives, white people take advantage of the very race privilege we claim not to have. As long as white people require conversations about race to be comfortable for us, racial equality will be a lot harder to achieve. So what do we do when our rules stand in the way of dealing constructively with racism? The answer is, we break the rules. The best way to defeat white fragility is to grow a thicker skin. Build your racial stamina by following some do's and don'ts. Don't assume you are objective or an authority on the experiences of people of color. In a racialized society, whites inevitably have a blind spot. Resist the urge to get defensive when people of color speak honestly about their experiences. Catch yourself whenever you find yourself thinking that a Black person's perspective is divisive or abusive. That's often a sign that you lack understanding. Don't recenter a conversation or narrative involving race around you or your feelings. Instead, cede the floor to your neighbors of color to amplify and learn from their perspectives. Explore the complexity of individuals you disagree with or don't understand. Your realities are totally different, and you will never breach that divide by running away from or silencing uncomfortable exchanges. Before getting angry, think about the root cause or need behind someone's emotional outburst or complaint. What you're interpreting as impoliteness or vitriol may be the best available means for them to express their experience of racism. Remember, in this society, white people are safer, included, and seen by default. The same is not true for people of color, which is why forcing them to shoulder the burden of fighting for equality, requiring them to be friendly and helpful in the face of white ignorance, and expecting them to give white people the benefit of the doubt, is not only wrong but also makes well-meaning white people complicit in their oppression. Choosing not to be sensitive in a world that already shelters you will improve your racial resiliency, lead to better relationships with your Black and brown friends and neighbors, and most importantly, create necessary space for the equality and justice that people of color deserve.
Right. The Rise District is a really great organization, puts a lot of content, great content together. So Dr. Robin D'Angelo, so she coined the term white fragility, but it's also good to understand too that people were talking about this stuff before she coined this term. It was just called white comfort or white discomfort, but she really has done a great job kind of adding to that. So she writes that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Socialized in a deeply internalized sense of superiority and entitlement that we are either not consciously aware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. So we experience the challenge to our racial worldview as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. It also challenges our sense of rightful place in hierarchy. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as very unsettling and unfair moral offense. So I'm going to play a really quick video of Robin D'Angelo. She's going to give a little speech about the good-bad binary. I think we're a lot of our opposition to talking about race is because we've associated, racism as like, good people are racist, bad people, or, good people aren't racist, bad people are racist, when in reality, we've all were born into the system. We've all internalized this system. It doesn't matter about good or bad, but she talks about how this is like one of the biggest problems and hurdles. And unfortunately, I made notes, maybe this button, I made notes on where to start this slide, but they don't pop up on Zoom. So I think it's right about here. Just give me a second.
To say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. Racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help. And of course, sketchy is very much associated.
Okay.
Where are the good neighborhood language? So the is through the power of segregation. Most convey that there was any loss.
Okay, I think it's.
I'm going to repeat that because I think I can live my whole life and my good college and my good course if my government saw us in the line of work.
I may have to.
That is what I call this system. I am responsible for changing it. Because the deep is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted, and ignorant, and Southern, and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're Northern. And this binary is probably the #1 construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person, right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often in my trainings, after I've kind of laid out kind of how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And, you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never. Right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback, because that binary sets us up to defend. Right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist. Right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like? This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. Returning to the pillar.
So Robin DiAngelo, she talked about a lot of different reactions. I think she came up with white fragility. She didn't, come up with white fragility necessarily, but she coined the term, but it definitely came from a lot of people have been talking about like this white discomfort, this reaction to racism and white privilege that white people feel. And one of the main reasons for this, we have to understand, we're going to talk about white supremacy in a little bit, and how it's built to like maintain itself, and that this is one of the reasons this white discomfort, this white centering is the reason for that. The reason is to maintain the status quo. And if the status quo is racism and white supremacy, then anytime you want to avoid the conversation or you derail the conversation, you're essentially maintaining white supremacy. And we call that white centering, is when you prioritize and value white people's feelings over black people's experiences with racism. And there's a lot of different ways that this comes out. A big one is like defensiveness, dominance. So a lot of this is like, we've all gotten in conversations with people like this where when they feel like they're wrong, they just become so unbearable. They just bully, they dominate the conversation. They're super mean, to the point that you just want to leave the conversation. And by you leaving, then you're maintaining, I mean, sometimes with these people you have to leave, to say, but the whole point is like when you leave, they're maintaining the status quo. A big one I get a lot is like annoyance, like when I try to bring up something about racism, a lot of people are like, oh, here's Josh, ruining the moment again. Can't we just enjoy a moment, for once? Why does everything have to be about race? And or another thing, people get insulted and they'll start questioning their friendship. It's like, I thought we were friends, or I thought you knew me better, I thought you knew that I care about black people, I thought we had a relationship where we can be open open with our thoughts, you know. Yeah, all that stuff can happen, but you also need to be accountable for what you say and your friend, you know. So it's tough. I mean, just by, you know, me confronting you on something that, you know, you're saying is racist, that doesn't mean I still not friends or don't value. I mean, in fact, I'm only a lot of times when Black people give feedback to white people, is because they do value their friendship, you know, and they want it, but they know, they understand that they don't fix things like this, that they're not going to be able to maintain that. And then like white victimhood and white tears, this is another one where we make it about ourselves, and we kind of change the roles of the victim and the oppressor, where we're the victims, you know, and all these, you know, very angry, you know, divisive people are attacking us, and it's just, I can't say anything right anymore. Or you know, we hear a lot like, not all white people, you know, if someone's trying to, you know, say, you know, something about, you know, white culture, and we always instantly, you know, we want to be the good white person. We want to say not all white people, even though we're, you know, whether we like it or not, we're part of this, like, you know, white supremacy culture. We're benefiting from this, regardless if we're in it. So I mean, don't ever say not all white people. But I'm not like that, you know, we want to distance ourselves from this, you know. I would never do that, you know. Try and be, you know, you want recognition that you're the good white person, rather than just listening to what that Black indigenous person of color has to say. White guilt is a big one, you know. You know, it's important, not yet, it's hard not to feel some white guilt, you know, once you start understanding the realities and histories of this country. But at the same time, you don't want to act on white guilt, because white guilt is either, one, is going to come out as like, you know, are really hurt, you feel bad, and you need people to make you feel better, so you're centering back to yourself. Or it's just like, this is what I did for most of my 20s. I just felt so guilty that I avoided things, you know. I avoided issues of race because I didn't know how to deal with it. So be careful of the white guilt. And victim blaming is another one, like finding a reason to justify, you know, racist actions, like, oh, if he just listened to that cop better, or if he didn't run away, or if he, you know, if he wasn't on drugs, he'd still be alive today. When in reality, none of that justifies, you know, the death penalty. And not even that, like, cops don't get to issue the death penalties, you know. So it's, yeah, it's, you know, we have to be really careful. Whenever we start seeing, like, you know, a police murder, instantly we start seeing the record, you know, criminal records of that person, you know, start seeing, like, you know, was that person on drugs, the autopsy, all these different things that try to justify the murder, when in reality, nothing justifies that murder. And I want to bring, I think I wrote this on an article a while ago, but I don't know if we remember, so much has happened since then, but the incident with a Catholic, you know, high school from Kentucky came out to the mall, you know, all wearing, you know, Make America Great hats and stuff, and they got in a confrontation. This was back in like early, you know, 2019 early, and then, you know, they're hanging around for the buses, and there's a group, we call them Black Israelites, and they, you know, they could be offensive, you know. They were shouting some homophobic things at these kids, and the kids in return were starting, you know, shouting a lot of kind of racist things and stuff, and getting agitated. So it's a group of Native protesters that are in the area, and they came up to try to defuse the situation a little bit. And what white kids did, you know, was they basically surrounded these protesters, you know, did all kinds of like racist, like, you know, tomahawks and gestures, you know, saying, you know, a lot of really messed up racist things. And even this like main kid, Nick, like, you know, I mean, there's videos of him, he was like way over on their side, and you can see this one video, he like purposely goes all to, you know, confront this guy and stops him from moving as all the kids are surrounding him. It's a very intimidating situation. And, you know, and when that first came out, everyone was like, you know, that was super racist, you know, like we was being condemned, you know, we were condemning these kids, but within like less than 24 hours, all these things started coming back out, you know, like, you know, all these people in media were like getting defensive. They're like, well, what would you expect these kids to do? You know, they're just high school kids, you know, like, what do you want this guy to do? Well, one, like, yeah, move aside and stop surrounding them, stop doing tomahawks, stop doing, you know, but, and then they're like, well, and then we did some victim blaming, you know, and like, you know, it was like they were talking about, well, the Black Israelites started. They were saying all these offensive things. It's like, yeah, whatever they said doesn't not justify, you know, what these white kids did to these Native, you know, protesters, you know. So it's just, you know, and it's like victimhood, you know, and to the point where like this kid's parents actually sued CNN for accurately reporting on this incident. And I've heard they settled. They won't say how much they settled, but that's like how, like within a a day or so, even most of my liberal friends were like on these kids' side. So it's just like how quickly this flips the script so we never really had this real conversation about the racism that was like being taught in these and high schools. Instead, it was about the victimhood of these white kids. So it's really, it was really fascinating. I wrote an article if you want to read a little bit more, just kind of following how this all played out as well. But yeah, it's crazy. Another one is so straw man arguments or logical fallacies. So there's a lot of logical fallacies out there. We're actually going to we have a whole class on confronting racism. We're going to dive deep into logical fallacies, because logical fallacies are when people manipulate your argument and try in different ways. And there's a couple up here: slippery slope, straw man, all that stuff. I feel like the straw man is one I see the most of. But it's worthwhile to spend a little time on googling logical fallacies, because as you read these, you're going to be like, I see this stuff all the time. I know my one friend does this all the time, and one friend does that, because it's played out. Especially the NRA uses it. Israeli advocacy organizations and stuff uses it a lot. If you try to criticize Israel, suddenly you're in a conversation about whether you're anti-Semitic or not. So it's like but a straw man is basically when you manipulate the argument into something that you can, that you can more easily win, so for example, if I say, hey, that thing you said was offensive, and immediately that person comes back and says, are you calling me a racist? Or do you have any idea how hard my life has been? What are you talking about, white privilege? And it's like, I didn't call you racist. I said that thing you said was offensive. Can we talk about that thing? But instead, it's like, now we're back and forth about whether this person's racist or not. And so it's like manipulating, that the conversation and to something that they can more easily win. Another one is like redefining racism, post-racial, color blindness. I don't see color. We are all people. I see this one a lot. The social construct. Race is a social construct. To divide us, and so you're just trying to divide us. I see this a lot because then people read, because yes, race was social construct that was black race was invented in Portugal to justify slavery, but white was actually invented. White was invented in the 1700s in Virginia to actually divide the poor black and poor white and create what's called a racial bribe, where the poor white people would more likely side with rich white people against the black people. And we'll talk a lot more about that in their class. But yes, race is a social construct, but the racism that was created during that, the hundreds of years of racism that was felt because of that social construct, it's even still be felt today, is very much real. Don't let people say that, you're, because I get that a lot. It's like, you're just, you need to stop talking about race because it's just a social construct to divide us, and don't let that stuff happen. Denying, dismissing, minimizing, black, indigenous people of color, white explaining. So if your friend of color, says like they've had this bad experience with the cops yesterday, you just tell them, oh, well, white explaining is when you're like, well, it wasn't really racist. Let me tell you what really happened and stuff. It's so offensive. It's like, it's one, you just, it's offensive on many different levels, but one of the reasons why it's so offensive is it basically saying that black people are incapable of understanding concepts like racism and their own marginalization. So it's very patronizing. Don't be a white explainer. It's not that bad, don't try to downplay it. It is that bad, trust me. It is that bad. Don't say, oh, in other countries it's worse. That doesn't matter. And that's a whataboutism. We're dealing with what's in this country right now. Gaslighting is when you try to it's a manipulation tactic when you try to create doubt in the victim's mind. Like if someone experienced racism, and then you're trying to be like, oh, you're just overreacting. There's probably more to that story. Probably not remembering it right. So you're gaslighting that person. And DARVO is like it's an acronym for like a large scale gaslighting, like when a celebrity or someone's called out, or politician's called out for a racist act. They do a DARVO, which is to deny, say, how dare you call me a racist? You know, I have black friends. I have done so much for the black community. How do you know? And then they attack. You know, what about attack the person that's calling the person out? Like like they're the problem. For being so divisive and for always mentioning race. And then they do this reverse victim and offender, where now they're the victim and the person is accusing them of saying something that was racist is now the offender. So be careful of that stuff for sure. And then a lot of it, we're going to have next class, we're going to dive really deeply into respectability politics, but just really quickly, this is just a common reaction that people, experience, white people do in the face of racism and white privilege, is, like, it's this idea that, there is some way that black people can act that will make things all better, kind of putting the blame on them, like they just act right. When in reality, look what happened to Colin Kaepernick, what that happened that, Martin Luther King, like there is no correct way to bring down racism, so don't believe this, and then they focus a lot on we're so divided, tribal. We spent a lot ever since 2016 about we're just, problem is we're all in tribal groups and all that stuff. No, the problem is we're living in a white supremacy society. All right, there is no they use words like racial divide. Like there is no two sides to racism. There's people who commit racism, there's victims of racism, and making it seem like there's some kind of divide or tribal or something is messed up, and people need to stop doing that. So like tone policing, spiritual bypassing. We just all need to love more universalism. Like my experiences are what everyone experiences. If I don't have any problems with cops, well, I mean, black people must be lying, so a lot of this, respectability politics. And then also white silence. So, just checking out, staying out of politics, ignoring, especially in on social media stuff. I see this all the time where white people are like, I just can't take it anymore. I'm taking a break from social media. Like, one, why are you even announcing that? Just take a break. I don't get people that say that. But two, also understand that, all your black friends are like, that's great. That's great that you can just close your computer and step away from racism, all the black indigenous people of color can't do that. So don't do that stuff. I mean, you can take care of yourself, but do it, do it in a way that's not, actually causing more harm to others. And then white discomfort is just we'll talk a lot more about this next class, but just like the idea of you're prioritizing your feelings and discomfort over, experiences of oppression. And there's a lot of reasons why people have these feelings, why white people can't really handle racism and white privilege. I mean, a lot of this is segregation. Majority of us have been segregated. We sell this idea that segregation just is all by choice, but the reality is by policy. And then we'll talk a lot more about that, throughout this series. But a lot of it's like, you just don't have, white people, for the most part, majority of white people live in only white, bubbles. So they don't see the negative consequences of racism. So they're like, what are you guys talking about? We live in a meritocracy, which is just not true. And then universalism, thinking that everyone experiences the world the same way we do. We're taught a very whitewashed history that does not explain, like the history that we teach does not explain at all the outcomes that we are experiencing. So then you have to come up with racist beliefs to explain that. Well, black people are just not trying hard enough, or they're not taking enough personal responsibility, which is not true. And then the myth of meritocracy again, that we can all make it if we just try, which is not if you look at the history of the last 400 years of white supremacy without reparations and the current white supremacy we're dealing with, that's just simply not true. I mean, people can still make it, but the people who do make it, the black indigenous people of color do make it, have to try much harder and deal with a lot more things than white people. And the belief that racism is dead, and post-racial colorblindness, if you believe that, believe that the 60s fixed that racism, then all this stuff is going to be really confusing. Why are people still protesting? And a lot of people, they worked hard, they had hard lives. Just because they're white doesn't mean that they didn't have a hard life. But the problem about white privilege is it's not about what you didn't do, it's about what you didn't have to put up with, what you didn't have to experience. So you worked hard hard, but you also worked hard and didn't have to deal with, you know, racism, didn't have to deal with, you know, racist employers, you know, racist cops, or, you know, all these things. So, and also, you know, a lot of times white people, they're always defined as individuals, you know, we're defined as individuals. If a white person shoots up a place, that's a, you know, a lone wolf, a crazy person. If a black person, you know, shoots up a place, or especially like a black Muslim terrorist or something, like, you know, then he's a representation of the terrorism and the violence in a particular culture. As white people are just individuals. And then a big one is like holding, you know, we're always fighting against narratives, you know, like we need to hold space for multiple narratives. It's not, you know, one narrative rules them all. Like, you know, understand which narrative you're fighting for. You know, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I mean, understand that the narrative, we need to make space for multiple narratives in the equation. It's not just that, you know, my experiences with the world is what matters. It's my experiences and everyone, you know, black person's experiences. That's what makes the, you know, we need to understand all this stuff, the white privilege and the racism at the same time. And white people, just a big thing I hear a lot is white people just don't know what they don't know about racism. It's like that's the idea, the silly idea of being woke, you know, like I always think, you know, if you think you're woke, then I always think I'm woke, and then I learn something new. I was like, whoa, I wasn't woke, but now I'm woke, you know. And then next week I learned something new. I'm like, no, I was definitely not woke. But now, I mean, we're never woke. I mean, the woke is stop trying to be woke. There's always going to be more stuff for us to learn and to overcome. And then a couple other reasons. Again, we talked about a lot of this stuff, but believing that racism is explicit choice, you know, the good bad binary. So if I'm, you know, if only if only bad people are racist, then how, you know, I can't be a part of racism because I want to be a good person, you know, or I had good intentions, you know. And, so how can I be racist if I don't have racist intentions? But really, it's about the outcome. And a lot of it's just about the need for our white comfort. We need to be comfortable with our racial hierarchy and where we are, you know, even if that means dismissing, you know, Black, Indigenous, you know, people of color's experiences and maintaining white comfort. Right, and so there's a really great Henny is a great author, great activist, great person to follow on social media. She does a lot of great work, but she created this white fragility self-test, and it's a really fantastic test to take. Again, like I said, we're not, you know, and once you get past this, like, I'm not a bad person. I'm just was born in this white supremacy society. I'm internalized these things, and so it's a good thing to ask yourself these questions and try to see if there's some kind of, you know, emotional reaction that you're getting from, you know, or even physical. A lot of times, you know, we physically, you know, react to things. We may, you know, our heartbeat may get faster. We may get, you know, sweaty, things like that. You know, so. But, you know, I just highlighted a couple of questions, but I definitely recommend everyone kind of taking this test on your own time and just kind of, you know, sitting with some of these feelings. But then one, do I feel defensive when a person of color says white people? You know, do I feel angry when people tell me that I benefit from white privilege? Just, you know, saying not all white people or similar phrases make me feel better when someone calls white people out for something. For sure. I mean, that's something I hear a lot of, is when like a person of color or a Black, Indigenous person of color, you know, tries, you know, say something like, you know, white people get, you know, better home loans, or they get treated better by police, or they do this or that. And then someone's always said, well, not all white people. And even if you're not like consciously, you know, doing this, what they're talking about is this system that benefits white people. So even if you're not the one consciously doing this, you're still part of this system. You're still part of, you know, these benefits. So yeah, don't say not all white people, for sure. Do I think that racism would go away if people stopped talking about it? Does being told that that something I say, think, or do, or otherwise value is racist make me want to shut down, leave, or express my discomfort? Or do I feel the need to prove that I'm not racist? Well, yeah, I definitely recommend everyone kind of take this test on your own. And then just a couple tips when you're approaching, you know, like racism and conversations about racism and white privilege, and when you're being called out, you know, try to approach this with humility, not ego. Try to build a tolerance to discomfort. Avoid that, don't feel shame, don't feel guilt. We've all been born in this. We all were taught this. It's not about, right or wrong or who's good, a good white person and who's a bad one. It's about just understanding we're all part of this, and we all need to, do our, work on, understanding our internalizations and understanding how we dismantle these systems, avoid trying to be the good white person, and believe, Black, Indigenous people, colors, experiences. Reflect on their feedback. When someone gives you feedback, it's oftentimes it's because they actually care about you and they wanted to continue having a relationship with you. So they want to give you feedback, so, to let you know what they need to continue being your friend. A lot of times it's not just an attack, even though it may come out, harsh. But it's, we need to understand what's behind that, understand their reactionary feelings, and also just apologizing, not just apologizing, but also, working on course correcting, working on, trying to change, your react, appreciating that feedback. I taught this food justice course a little while ago, and we talked about, the different waves of xenophobic waves against Latinx immigrants, throughout the last century, because we created this food system basically, on the plantation system that needed exploited labor, and then when the Black people were free, there was convict leasing, and when that went away, we basically relied on, cheap immigrants to fuel our food systems. And I talked about all the different movements. We have these movements where we need these workers, and then they, and then something happens like the Great Depression, or veterans are returning from, war, and then you can't find a job, or like Trump, and these different, so then these immigrants are scapegoated, and then we have these massive forms of deportation and violence, and then, we go back to, we need more labor, so we start, it's just this ongoing phase. And there was this one, Eisenhower did this campaign, I'm not going to say the name, but it's Operation, I'll just say WB, and he, deported like over 1 million immigrants. And I said the name, and the name was actually a derogatory term for Latinx immigrants, and someone in the class, like, emailed me afterwards and told me about that, and told me he felt very offended that, I would, say that out loud, and he's been called that all his life. And we had a conversation, and we talked about it, and how it's, and now I don't say that out loud. I'll post it, but I'll say why I don't post it. But I mean, that, I felt like you can grow from these conversations, from this stuff. So it's definitely, if you could just get past that, it could be a really meaningful, experience. There's one more video, again, Francis Ramsey, talking about how to actually apologize and oh man, I wish I had my notes on where to start this video. I think I'm
Hey guys, so today I want to talk about getting called out and how to apologize. And the thing that inspired this video is recently we've had a lot of celebrities in the media screwing up, getting called out, and then offering faux apologies, like Russell Simmons, Paula Deen, Anthony Weiner, most recently Cheryl Underwood. I wanted to talk about what you're supposed to do when you get called out and the way to apologize so that people believe you and know you're actually committed to change. When I talk about getting called out, what exactly do I mean? It's not just getting your feelings hurt or someone pointing out that you took the last slice of pizza. Getting called out in this context of this video is when you say or do something that upholds the oppression of a marginalized group of people. So for example, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, something that you've said or done that basically is just perpetuating negative stereotypes or ideals that have real consequences. So in my social responsibility video, we talked about why making jokes about really serious issues or minimizing serious issues has negative consequences. But now I want to talk about what happens when that's brought to your attention and how you can successfully apologize and become an ally and now be committed to changing your behavior and doing the right thing. Usually when you call out someone's behavior or something that they've said, the natural reaction is to get defensive. You're so sensitive. I was just joking. My best friend's Black. My sister's a lesbian. You are are so emotional. You know, I didn't mean it that way. Everybody has to be so PC nowadays. Now I can completely understand why people usually react this way. It's because no one wants to be the bad guy. And if you get called out on doing something that's oppressing another group of people, well, that's bad, and no one wants to be bad. But I want to discourage you from going that route, because what you really need to do is listen, because this is where the other person is hopefully going to explain to you what you did wrong and how you can change it. Another thing that people tend to fall back on in these instances is their intent. Oh, I didn't mean it like that, or you're interpreting it the wrong way. In these instances, I know that you might think that that makes a difference, but we're not really worrying about your intent here, because of course you didn't mean to offend anyone. There really aren't that many people that walk around trying to offend people. I mean, there are those people, and they're jerks, and why would you want to be friends with those types of people? Your intent really doesn't matter, because it's a matter of intent versus impact. And that's actually something I learned from a really good friend of mine, Jukebox Jones on Facebook. It doesn't matter in these instances what you meant. What matters is what's the outcome of what you said or what you did. I use the example of stepping on somebody's foot. I might step on your foot and break your toe. I didn't mean to break your toe, but your toe is still broken and it still really hurts. So instead of talking about what you meant to do, talk about what you actually did. Which brings me to the next part of this video: good apologies versus bad apologies. Now, the first most common bad non-apology that I hear: I'm sorry that you were offended. That is like the worst non-apology ever, because instead of taking responsibility for your actions, you're putting the blame on the other person and saying that it's your fault that you're offended, not that you did something that offended them. So don't make that mistake. Another one that I hear a lot of times is, I'm sorry if you were offended. That one doesn't cut it either, because the person is offended. So there's no reason to bring up if, and it also doesn't acknowledge what you did wrong and why it was wrong, because you're saying if you were offended, I'm sorry, but if you weren't offended, I'm not sorry. And again, that's not how you do this apology thing. A real genuine apology is made up of two parts. The first part is you take responsibility for what you've done, and then the second part is you make a commitment to change the behavior. It's that simple, and trust me, as someone that's apologized more than a few times, as someone that's been called out more than a few times, it's not really that hard to do. The best way that I can figure out to drive this point home is to give you an example using myself. So about 2 years ago, I made this video called Queen for a Day, where I dressed up as a drag queen, went around New York City, and asked people to guess if I was a man or a woman. I thought the video was hysterical. My friends thought it was really funny. It did really well on YouTube. And it wasn't until about a year later that someone brought to my attention that it was super offensive. They were like, hey, this is some transphobic garbage. Why would you do something like this? Now, of course, my initial reaction was to get defensive. I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not transphobic. What does that even mean? I have friends that are trans. I didn't mean it that way. It's just a joke. You're taking this too personally. I did all of the things that you're not supposed to do. So instead, I stopped and I listened. And they explained that if you're trans, having people try to figure out what your gender is like a daily battle. And it's not really fun, and it's super rude. And making a video that encourages that and kind of makes a game or something funny out of questioning someone's gender is basically encouraging people to participate in that type of behavior. And that's really, really bad, especially when you consider the fact that there are trans people who are regularly assaulted and murdered because people are trying to question and figure out how they identify. So once this was brought to my attention, I was like, you're right. I'm so sorry. Didn't need to talk about what my intent was or why I did it. Instead, I just said, wow, I'm really sorry. I'm really going to make sure that I don't do that again. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I ended up taking the video down, and since then I've really made an effort to be more aware of trans issues and try to be a better ally to the trans people in my life and in my online community. And it was surprisingly not that hard or life-changing to admit that I did something wrong. And it felt really good to know that I fixed the problem and that now I'm part of the solution. The first thing that you want to do is acknowledge what went wrong.
All right. All right. And the last thing I want to say, when you're actually, having these conversations, especially on social media, it's always good just to have a couple good memes when you just can't talk any longer. It's good to have a couple just on hand. And this is one I post a lot on a lot of people's Facebook pages. It's good to have some good ones like this. All right, so we're gonna go quickly through this next section. So this next section is really focused on a lot of the common excuses that people make to kind of avoid, having to actually talk about racism and white privilege and things like that. It's just good, to actually do some practice and actually have good answers to a lot of these excuses on hand. So when you do, find yourself in these moments and you're in these conversations, you don't you want to have good, simple from the heart, answers, and not big long data answers, not long sentence. You want to just, it's good to have some really good, answers. It's good to personalize your answers as well. We're going to talk a lot about this in our class to kind of on confronting racism, is to kind of make it more about yourself. When you're stuck, go deep kind of thing. There's a link down here that has a lot of data for a lot of these excuses. So when you if you see some of them, and you're not sure how to actually answer some of them, you can definitely go to this link, and we'll talk about some of them as well. And then at the end of this section, we'll actually do some activities. We'll answer a couple of them, a couple common ones that are happening around the protests. But the first section, I kind of, separate all the excuses into different categories. And the first one is like denial. I'm just going to pick out a couple of them, and we're going to kind of go quickly through this section. But definitely, read them all. And if there's ones that you see that it's good to kind of do some research and have some good prepared answers for that. But big ones like slavery was a long time ago. Why are we still talking about this? When in reality, it was just a couple generations ago. And even slavery, when it ended, the systems of white supremacy systems that is created when it ended, we're still living in, we're still dealing with. So slavery in reality didn't end. Race is a social construct. I get this a lot, where like, you're just, because race was, yes, race was invented, especially whiteness was invented. It's called the racial bribe in the 1700s to kind of divide, poor black and poor white people, so they wouldn't unite against the aristocracy. So yes, that race was created to divide things, it's a social construct, but the racism that came after that is and the racism that people have felt for centuries and are still feeling today is very, very much real. Or my ancestors never owned slaves, trying to be denied being a part of this system. So even if you just immigrated, from your, even if you just came over recently, you're still experiencing, you may not, own slaves, but you're still experiencing the benefits of this white supremacy society that was created from our slavetocracy. And we talked a lot about not all white people as well. Minimalization, so we see a lot of this as well. It's not that bad, or what about isms? We're talking about police brutality, and they're like, well, what about this or that? Things that have higher mortality rates, but have nothing to do with the conversation we're talking about. It's just as a derailing tactic. But in reality, it is that bad. I mean, that's the thing. It totally is that bad. Lighten up, it's just a joke, things like that. A big one is spiritual bypassing. So this, see this a lot, from people that try to say, well, we're just all one human race. We just need to be more positive. We need to be more kind to each other. We're so divisive, and the reality is they're using this to kind of bypass the actual work that we need to do, to dismantle white supremacy, and they're making this just, we just need be more kind, but being kind is never dismantled oppressive systems. So this is a big one, difference of opinion excuse. So this is where people summarize a lot of oppressive beliefs and oppression and things as it's just a difference of opinion. It's just like a different politics, and so this was actually exciting. That I don't know if you remember that the Ellen Bush controversy, but that actually happened during our last class, and we got to talk about it that week, where Ellen DeGeneres she was, there's a bunch of pictures of her hanging out with Bush, Bush Jr., George Bush Jr. And, a lot of people criticize her, like, how can you hang out with this person with all the things that he's done? And she, like, rebutted, this rebuttal was like, in fact, I'm friends with a lot of people who don't share the same beliefs. We've all, she talks about how we just, we need to be kind with people that see the world differently. And I think some people were on board with that because they were just thinking that, because he had a lot of homophobic policies, a lot of anti-gay policies. So they're thinking, well, she's gay, she's part of that. It's okay for her to kind of forgive that. But the more disturbing part is George Bush is a war criminal. He started a war that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis based on lies, and that's not like a different aside. I mean, these are facts. Like he made up lies about weapons of mass destruction to launch a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and the fact that that's not like a difference of opinion. This is a great quote. Just a reminder: bullying down the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, attacks on LGBTQIA rights, attacks on reproductive rights, and destruction of civil liberties is a matter of different politics. It's really effing monstrous. So these aren't saying that this is a difference of opinion. It's crazy. So Son of Baldwin, he's an activist. He wrote, "We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." And this is a really great one. We can disagree on trans issues. No, we really can't, because disagreeing with the validity of someone's identity and the rights and services that they deserve or don't deserve because of it is discrimination. It's not disagreement. So I think that's important to understand. There's some things they're just not difference of opinions. That they're whitewashed histories that these people are defending. And we even talked about Ellen could still be friends with Bush, but she can also confront him on this stuff and have him realize what he did. There's a lot of different. It's not like you can't stop being friends, but you need to recognize what's going on and hold people accountable for that. So there's a question. So what is the appropriate response regarding racist relatives? I'm sorry, they're wrong, or something in that order. That's a tough one. I actually took this class where they talked about, especially with racist relatives, there's a lot of strategies. We'll talk a lot more about strategies in the confrontation class, but they talked a lot about, coming up with game plans, realizing, especially when you're going to Thanksgiving and things like that, realizing that, certain people in your family listen better to other people in your family, so let's say no one listens to me, but I know, my dad, maybe my dad will say something racist and he listens better to my mom. So, creating these game plans, where you get, people, that they'll listen to better, to talk to and confront them. A lot of it's like calling in, not calling out, having personal conversations with them. Don't try to do this in front of everyone and kind of make this like a public shaming. A lot of this is like, like I said, if they're resisting, make it personal about you. When you're stuck, go deep. Make it about, let them know how this personally affects you. There's a lot of strategies for it, but there's no silver bullet, and it probably doesn't work more than it does, but the important thing is to keep on trying to work on that. So we'll have a whole class on just how to confront racism as well. So lack of intent, we talked a lot about this. It doesn't matter about intentions, things like that. Blame shifting and victim, blaming. So we hear a lot about this, when someone is murdered by the police, all of a sudden, we're hearing in the news about how they were criminals, or they had drugs in their system, or, they had a track record, all this stuff, just to kind of shift the blame to this person like he deserved to die, when in reality, there's nothing someone, there's nothing someone can do that deserves to be killed by, a police like that, especially when, unarmed people in handcuffs, So it doesn't matter what they did in their past. It doesn't matter, who they were, so it's a form of blame shifting, trying to, shift the blame. Respectability politics, like you're not helping, about tone policing. There's a right way to talk about this, or a lot of it's like, the people talk about real problems. We're so divided, we're so uncivil. Not that the real problem is that we live in a, racist society, but it's we're divided and we can't. But a lot of times, that is, that's people's judgments about whether they're divided or not. Oftentimes has, it's about their white group that's more divided and uncivil, or what's going, So it's, yeah, for sure. A lot of the competing victimizations that we see, people will talk about, well, I'm Irish. I had Irish, ancestors that were victimized in this country. But yes, they were, but at the same time, they weren't enslaved. They didn't have a whole system that was based on, anti-Blackness or anti-Indigenous. And then eventually they became, they achieved the status of whiteness, so and that part of that status was continuing to be oppressive towards, people, Black people. So I don't have white, how can you say I have white privilege? I worked hard for my living. Just like white privilege isn't so much about what you have, but it's so much about what you didn't have to deal with. Yes, you worked hard. Yes, you dealt with a lot of crap. At the same time, you didn't have to deal with racism at every single possible corner. All right. So the last section we're going to talk about, I want to just kind of give some talk about certain common excuses that we're seeing right now with the recent protests against police brutality, and we're seeing a lot of excuses on trying to downplay and minimize what's happening in this world. And I want to kind of talk about it. I actually want to give some answers to these. So I'll be providing a couple, common rebuttals. I mean, you may not want to use these rebuttals for everything, but it should give you some idea of how to make your own rebuttals. The first one we hear a lot of is if people just follow the law, if they don't run, if they get out of the car, if they follow police orders, they'd be fine. And the reality is a lot of people do all that stuff and Black people and still get killed. Like there's a great list. I mean, this is a short list, but Sandra Bland, all these people, were in police custody. Freddie Gray had his spinal cord snapped in police custody. It doesn't matter about, following orders. None of these things, by not following the law, you run away. None of these things deserve murder. And then there's a really great quote, "Dear world, Black people do not want to exit our vehicles in cop-related incidents because we've seen that the end in murder too many times." So when you're seeing so much murder of Black people on these, caught on tape, it's legitimate not to want to leave your car. Because I mean, I totally, would be scared. I would be petrified to leave my car when a cop tells me to, when I know how likely, if I was Black, and I know how likely that I would die from that experience. Many of the people killed that had criminal records is another excuse, but this is a form of victim blaming. Like again, one is you don't know what kind of environment that person grew up in, what challenges he had. A lot of times crime is a lack of economic opportunity. And even so, whatever that person did, in the past does not justify his murder at all. There's no past incident that justifies murder by the hands of police. Another one is what about Black on Black crimes? I hear this a lot. So it's really important to understand most violence occurs between victims and offenders of the same race. So most white victims are criminalized by white people. Most Asian victims are criminalized by Asian people because we're all so segregated. So yes, most Black crime is committed by Black people, but that's pointless. No one ever says white on white crimes. No one ever says Asian on Asian crimes. And the reason why that is because it's just. That only comes up, Black on Black crime only comes up in direct response to a Black, a police killing Black people. It's a direct response to try to victim blame and try to take the blame off of the cop who murdered somebody and put it back on Black communities are just more, so, dangerous. They have to be controlled by violence. Another one you hear a lot, the problem is Black people commit more crime. And this is, you gotta be careful with this one. So a lot of times, people that do, say this, they use a lot of skewed stats and, statistics at trying to prove this point. So one, it's a lot of this is based on bad statistics, but there are Black communities where there's a lot of crime that's occurring more than neighboring white communities. And we have to really understand that this has nothing to do with the color of the skin. This has to do with economic opportunities and concentrations of poverty. Poverty is the main predictor of crime, not race. So any poor neighborhood that lacks economic opportunity, that has terrible schools, has no economic opportunity, more people are going to resort to crime, as opposed to a nice neighborhood that has well-funded schools and lots of job opportunities. And it just so happens, because of our history of this country, we disproportionately speaking, Black, Indigenous people of color are more focused in concentrated poverty. So, but at the same time, how we deal with that, instead of helping them out and investing in these communities, we over-police these communities, which is, also again produces a lot of statistics, about. It's the cycle, because we over-police them, because we disinvest them, because we force them into concentrated poverty, we were able to produce these statistics that say they produce a lot of crime, which justifies doing over-policing them even more, and that we never actually get to the roots of the problem. Never, escape this cycle. And at the same time, we also enforce the law differently. White people and Black people sell drugs and use drugs about the same rates, but Black people are 3 times more likely to be arrested for drugs and 5 times more likely to be incarcerated. When you think about the crack epidemic, when if someone says a crack epidemic, you instantly, there's a race you instantly think about, and that's Black. But in reality, I've read many studies where white people use crack not only equal, but I've read many studies that they actually use crack a little bit more, than Black people, just, proportionally speaking, but it's not, the war on drugs was never about arresting Black or white, crack users. It was about a racialized criminal war, or a racialized war against criminalizing Black people. And then, we hear, why can't you protest peacefully like Dr. King? Again, we mentioned this. Dr. King was shot, Colin Kaepernick, probably the most peaceful thing you could do is just take a knee and look at, he lost his career, he's emboldened, a whole movements of racist white people, just by taking a knee. So we gotta stop saying that. Jesse Williams gave this great quote during the BET Humanitarian Award acceptance. He said, "If you have a critique for the resistance, for our resistance, then you better have an established record of critique of our oppression." And then when I support their cause, but I don't support the looting and rioting. So why do you value? That's a good question. Why? If you're more enraged by property damage than you are by Black lives being murdered in the street on TV with no consequences, you got the problems with you. You need to understand. You need to relook at your values, because there's not one single life that is less important than the property. And then when we say blue lives matter, all lives matter, so all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. The reason why we say Black lives matter is because they don't. There's so many systems that devalue Black lives in this country. And blue lives, that's a choice. People can take off their uniform, especially, they go home at the end of the day, they take their uniform off. Black lives can never take off their color. So let's not, stop, equating these two. And all lives matter is basically a nice way of saying white lives matter, because when white is a norm, when we say all lives, we really mean white lives. So let's get that down first. So this last section, I'm going to play a video for the last section. This is someone that mentioned this earlier about author Kimberly Jones dresses, looting and the broken social contract. So this was filmed right after probably the first couple days in Minnesota after George Floyd was killed.
So I've been seeing a lot of things talking of the people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy Black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to fuck shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why. And that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor Blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up out of bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa. That was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. Social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Right. Such a powerful speech. So I'm thinking at this point, I mean, we're 2.5 hours in, or you know,